When the Great Earthquake struck Edo on the second day of the 10th month in 1855, the city's residents experienced what they called Ansei no Taishinsai, the Great Ansei Earthquake. The tremor lasted for approximately 4 to 10 minutes, an eternity when the ground beneath your feet transforms into liquid motion. But this disaster was not an isolated tragedy in the annals of Japanese history. It was merely one chapter in a centuries-long relationship between the Japanese archipelago and the violent tectonic forces that shaped it. What makes this story remarkable is not the destruction itself, but the elaborate machinery of reconstruction that the Japanese had perfected over generations, a system so efficient that entire neighborhoods could be rebuilt within months, not years. To understand how Japan rebuilt after earthquakes, we must first understand what they were rebuilding. Edo, by the mid-19th century, was the largest city on Earth, with a population exceeding 1 million souls packed into an urban landscape that was essentially a tinderbox waiting for ignition. The city sprawled along the eastern coast of Honshu, built on reclaimed marshland and filled earth that amplified seismic waves like a drumskin. The typical Edo townhouse, called a machiya, was a marvel of intentional fragility. These structures were not built to resist earthquakes. They were built to survive them through flexibility. The post and beam construction used a technique called kanawatsugi, a complex joinery system where wooden beams interlocked without nails, allowing the entire structure to sway and shift during tremors. The walls were made of wattle and daub, designed to crack and crumble rather than collapse catastrophically. The heavy tile roofs, ironically, served a dual purpose. Their weight kept the structure grounded during moderate shaking, while their ability to slide off during severe quakes prevented the entire building from being crushed under their mass. But this elegant engineering philosophy came with a terrible cost. When the earthquake struck in 1855, the initial shaking killed approximately 7,000 people outright. But the true catastrophe came in the hours that followed. Cooking fires in thousands of homes toppled over. Lanterns fell. The paper walls and wooden frames ignited instantly, and within minutes, entire neighborhoods were engulfed in flames that would rage for 3 days. The fire consumed an estimated 14,000 additional lives and destroyed approximately half of the city. The Sumida River, which normally served as a firebreak, became a corridor of death as burning debris floated downstream, igniting buildings on both banks. The sky turned black with ash, and survivors reported that noon looked like midnight, with only the orange glow of flames providing any illumination. In the immediate aftermath, the sophisticated social order of Tokugawa Japan faced its greatest test. Edo was not just a city. It was the administrative heart of the shogunate, a carefully orchestrated hierarchy where every person had a defined role and every district had a specific function. The samurai class, roughly 6% of the population, lived in vast estates that occupied nearly 70% of the city's land. These warrior bureaucrats were not just soldiers. They were the city's crisis management apparatus. Within hours of the earthquake, the Machi Bugyo, the city magistrates, activated emergency protocols that had been refined over centuries of disaster response. Messengers were dispatched on horseback to the outer provinces to request supplies. The magistrates ordered the immediate opening of the okurasho, the shogunate's emergency rice warehouses, which were strategically located throughout the city precisely for such catastrophes. But the real work of immediate survival fell to the Cho, the neighborhood associations that formed the cellular structure of Edo society. Each Cho consisted of several dozen households, and each had elected officials called nanushi, who served as intermediaries between the common people and the samurai administration. These nanushi maintained detailed registers of every resident, every building, and every resource within their district. When the earthquake struck, they immediately began accounting for survivors and organizing rescue parties. The Japanese had a saying, Jishin, Kaminari, Kaji, Oyachi. Earthquakes, thunder, fires, and fathers are the 4 most frightening things. But they had learned that earthquakes were survivable through preparation, and every household in Edo kept emergency supplies in wooden chests called hijo bukuro. These contained dried rice, pickled vegetables, flint and steel, rope, and most importantly, clean water in sealed ceramic containers. The physics of post-earthquake survival in Edo revolved around water and fire suppression. The city's elaborate water distribution system, which normally supplied fresh water from the Tamagawa aqueduct to thousands of wooden pipes throughout the city, was completely destroyed. The underground pipes, made from hollowed logs bound with bamboo hoops, had ruptured in hundreds of places. The ingenious masonry aqueducts that carried water over valleys had cracked, turning life-sustaining flow into useless drainage. In the days immediately after the quake, obtaining drinking water became the primary challenge for survivors. The wealthy had deep wells in their compounds, but for the majority of the population, water had to be carried in buckets from the Sumida River, which was now contaminated with ash, bodies, and debris. The shogunate's response was to mobilize the Haikushi, the firefighting brigades that were normally the domain of the Machi-Yako, the town gangs who had evolved from street toughs into semi-official civic organizations. These Haikushi understood that they could not extinguish the fires consuming Edo. The scale was too vast, and their water supplies too limited. Instead, they employed a brutal but effective tactic called kaji dogi, or fire breaking. Teams of men with long hooked poles called tobi-guchi would rush ahead of the flames and systematically demolish buildings in the fire's path, creating fire breaks wide enough that the flames could not jump across. This was not careful deconstruction, it was violent, rapid demolition where entire homes were pulled down in minutes. The property owners had no say in the matter. The greater good of the city superseded individual property rights, a principle so deeply embedded in Japanese disaster response that it required no debate or compensation. Thousands of structures that survived the earthquake were deliberately destroyed to save the city as a whole. The logistics of feeding 1 million people in a city where half the buildings no longer existed required an understanding of the koku economy that governed Tokugawa Japan. The koku was both a unit of measure, approximately 180 liters of rice, and the fundamental unit of wealth and taxation. A samurai's stipend was calculated in koku, as was a domain's productive capacity. The average person consumed about 1 koku of rice per year, making it the basis for all caloric calculations. The shogunate maintained strategic reserves in massive fireproof warehouses called kura, built with thick earthen walls and heavy doors that could withstand both flames and theft. These kura were distributed throughout Edo, but many had been damaged or destroyed in the earthquake. The surviving warehouses became fortresses, guarded by samurai to prevent looting, while bureaucrats calculated rations. The distribution system that emerged in the weeks after the earthquake revealed both the strengths and contradictions of Tokugawa social order. The shogunate established Osukui-goya, relief huts, throughout the devastated districts. These were temporary structures, hastily erected from salvaged timber, where survivors could receive daily rice rations. But the distribution was not egalitarian. Samurai families received larger portions, each reflecting their higher social status, even though many were now as destitute as the merchants and artisans they normally looked down upon. The complex hierarchy that governed normal life persisted even in catastrophe. A samurai who had lost everything still received the respect due to his class, while a wealthy merchant who had survived with his fortune intact was still officially beneath the poorest samurai in social standing. Yet in practice, money talked. Black markets sprang up immediately, with unscrupulous merchants hoarding rice and selling it at prices that would have been criminal in normal times. The shogunate attempted to suppress these markets with limited success, executing a handful of particularly egregious profiteers as examples, but the basic economics of scarcity could not be legislated away. The reconstruction of Edo began before the fires had fully burned out. Japanese urban planning, refined through centuries of earthquakes and conflagrations, operated on a principle that seems counterintuitive to modern sensibilities: acceptance of destruction. Rather than attempting to build cities that would never burn, the Japanese built cities that were designed to burn cleanly and be rebuilt quickly. The standard Machiya townhouse could be completely reconstructed by a team of carpenters in approximately 2 weeks. This was possible because of standardization and prefabrication that predated the Industrial Revolution by centuries. Carpenters maintained supplies of pre-cut beams and posts in standard dimensions. The joinery was so precisely calculated that experienced craftsmen could assemble a building frame without detailed plans, while working from memory and tradition. The city's lumber supply came from carefully managed forests in the mountains west of Edo, where foresters had been cultivating specific varieties of cypress and pine for construction for generations. These forests operated on rotation cycles that ensured a constant supply of timber, with trees being marked for harvest decades before they were needed. The shogunate's immediate priority was not individual homes, but the reconstruction of critical infrastructure. The first projects were the roads. Edo's major thoroughfares, like the Great Tokaido Highway that connected it to Kyoto, were the arteries through which supplies flowed. Teams of laborers were conscripted to clear rubble and repair the bridges that crossed the city's canals and rivers. This was back-breaking work performed without machinery, using simple tools: shovels, wooden carrying poles, woven baskets for hauling debris. The rubble itself became a resource. Broken roof tiles were sorted, and those that were still intact were saved for reuse. Shattered pottery was crushed and mixed with clay to create fill for raising the ground level in low-lying areas that had suffered liquefaction during the earthquake. Even ash from the fires was valuable, used as fertilizer in the rice paddies that surrounded the city. The reconstruction revealed the hidden economy of Edo, the networks of specialized craftsmen whose skills became suddenly indispensable. There were tile makers who had spent lifetimes perfecting the art of creating curved roof tiles that would interlock perfectly to shed rain. There were plasterers who knew the exact mixture of clay, sand, and straw that would create walls both flexible and durable. There were paper makers whose products would cover the sliding screens called shoji, and tatami makers who wove the rush mats that covered floors. Each of these crafts had guilds that controlled quality and training, and in the aftermath of the earthquake, these guilds found themselves with unprecedented bargaining power. The shogunate attempted to enforce price controls on construction materials and labor, but the reality of supply and demand meant that skilled craftsmen could command wages several times higher than normal. The social dynamics of reconstruction exposed fault lines in the rigid class system. Samurai whose estates had been destroyed found themselves dependent on the very merchant class they officially disdained. Merchants with liquid capital could rebuild quickly, purchasing prime real estate from impoverished samurai who needed immediate cash. This gradual transfer of economic power from the warrior class to the merchant class had been occurring for decades, but the earthquake accelerated it dramatically. Some samurai, facing financial ruin, abandoned their class identity entirely, cutting their top knots and entering trade, a decision that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras but became increasingly common in the late Tokugawa period. The temples and shrines of Edo played a crucial role that transcended their religious function. These structures were often the most substantial buildings in any district, built from stone and heavy timber with tile roofs. Many survived the earthquake and fires relatively intact, and they immediately became refugee centers. Buddhist temples opened their grounds to displaced families, providing not just shelter, but also emotional and spiritual support. The monks organized communal cooking, shared their own supplies, and performed rituals for the dead. Shinto shrines served similar functions, with priests maintaining order and distributing what resources they had. The religious institutions operated outside the strict class hierarchy, treating all refugees with a degree of equality that the secular authorities could not match. A merchant and a samurai might find themselves sleeping side by side on a temple floor, sharing a bowl of rice gruel, their worldly distinctions temporarily suspended by shared suffering. The engineering lessons learned from the 1855 earthquake influenced reconstruction in subtle but important ways. City planners, working under the direction of the Machi Bugyo, implemented wider fire breaks between districts. They mandated that certain main streets be widened to serve as evacuation routes. Some neighborhoods were redesigned with small open plazas that could serve as gathering points during disasters. There was even limited experimentation with more fire-resistant construction techniques, such as coating wooden beams with a mixture of clay and seaweed that provided some protection against flames. However, fundamental changes were limited by economic reality and cultural inertia. The Japanese had been building wooden cities for millennia, and the skills, materials, and social organizations built around that tradition could not be quickly abandoned. The psychological and cultural response to the earthquake revealed a distinctly Japanese approach to catastrophe. Rather than viewing disasters as divine punishment or random misfortune, the Japanese developed a philosophy of acceptance and resilience. The concept of shogunai, it cannot be helped, reflected a recognition that some forces were beyond human control, and that energy was better spent adapting than lamenting. This did not mean passive acceptance. Rather, it meant pragmatic focus on what could be controlled. Households that had survived previous earthquakes became sources of wisdom for neighbors, sharing techniques for preserving food, purifying water, and maintaining hygiene in crowded conditions. The elderly, who had lived through earlier disasters, commanded respect for their experience. Stories of past earthquakes were recounted not as horror tales, but as instructional narratives, emphasizing what had worked and what had failed. The reconstruction of Edo took approximately 2 years before the city regained something resembling its pre-earthquake functionality, but the process was uneven and complex. The wealthy districts where samurai and prosperous merchants lived were rebuilt relatively quickly, with high-quality materials and skilled craftsmen. The poorer districts, where day laborers and artisans lived in tiny rented rooms, remained devastated far longer. Some residents never returned, migrating instead to other cities or returning to rural villages they had left years earlier. The population of Edo dropped by an estimated 100,000 in the year following the earthquake, a demographic shock that took nearly a decade to reverse. This population movement had its own economic consequences, creating labor shortages in some industries while glutting others with desperate workers willing to accept any wage. The merchants who specialized in disaster goods found themselves in a peculiar position of profiting from tragedy. There were dealers in used building materials who scoured the ruins for salvageable timber and tile. There were entrepreneurs who organized gangs of laborers to clear rubble for a fee. There were moneylenders who offered loans to those seeking to rebuild, often at usurious rates that would trap borrowers in debt for years. The shogunate viewed these activities with suspicion, but lacked the administrative capacity to regulate them effectively. The gap between official policy and ground-level reality grew wider as the reconstruction progressed, reflecting the weakening authority of the Tokugawa regime in its final decades. The 1855 earthquake, like so many disasters before and after, became part of the collective memory of Edo, later renamed Tokyo. It was commemorated in woodblock prints that depicted both the destruction and the reconstruction, serving as visual records but also as moral lessons about resilience and community. The prints showed firefighters battling blazes, neighbors sharing food, and carpenters raising new buildings. These images circulated throughout Japan. They're purchased by people who had never seen Edo, but who understood that such disasters could strike their own cities at any time. The prints served an educational purpose, reminding viewers of proper behavior during catastrophes and glorifying those who had shown courage or generosity. The legacy of Japan's earthquake reconstruction systems extended far beyond any single disaster. The techniques refined over centuries, the flexible joinery, the firebreak demolition tactics, The emergency rice distribution networks, the rapid reconstruction protocols, became embedded in Japanese culture. When the Great Kanto earthquake struck Tokyo in 1923, killing over 100,000 people and destroying much of the city, the response drew directly on these historical precedents. Even after Japan industrialized and modernized, and adopting steel and concrete construction, the fundamental philosophy remained. Accept that disasters will occur, prepare for them systematically, and rebuild quickly with communal effort. The social structures that enabled rapid recovery, the neighborhood associations, the central stockpiling of emergency supplies, the clear chains of command, evolved but never disappeared. Understanding how ancient Japan rebuilt after massive earthquakes requires seeing beyond the physical reconstruction of buildings. It requires understanding a society that had developed institutional memory about disaster response, that had created economic and social structures specifically designed to manage catastrophe, and that had cultivated a cultural mindset accepting destruction as inevitable but not insurmountable. The carpenters who could raise a house in 2 weeks, the magistrates who could organize food distribution for thousands, the neighborhood officials who maintained order without police, the merchants who stockpiled emergency supplies, all were parts of a complex system that modern disaster management experts now study and admire. The Japanese did not conquer earthquakes. They learned to live with them, and in doing so, created one of the most resilient urban civilizations in human history. That resilience was not born from superior technology or wealth, but from centuries of experience, cultural adaptation, and a profound understanding that survival after catastrophe depends not on individual heroism, but on collective preparation and coordinated response.